The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Windsor Castle as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the final time. 28 years old, with steel blue eyes and an unwavering sense of duty, James had served as a Queen's Guard for 6 years. Today felt different somehow, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. The tourists were already gathering in large numbers, their cameras clicking away as they tried to capture the perfect shot of the famous guards in their iconic bearskin hats. James had grown accustomed to the attention, the whispered comments, and occasional attempts by visitors to make him break his stoic expression. It was all part of the job he had grown to love, as he took his position at the main entrance. James noticed a group of young tourists approaching. There were 4 of them, probably in their early 20s, speaking loudly in what sounded like a mix of different accents. They wore expensive designer clothes and carried the latest smartphones, clearly documenting every moment of their London adventure for social media. The leader of the group, a tall young man with bleached hair and an arrogant smirk, whispered something to his friends that made them all laugh. James remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight ahead. But his peripheral vision caught their movements as they positioned themselves directly in front of him. "Watch this," the blonde tourist said loudly enough for others nearby to hear. "I bet I can make this robot move." His friends giggled as they pulled out their phones, already recording what they expected to be another funny travel video to share with their followers back home. James had encountered countless attempts to break his concentration over the years. Tourists would wave flags in front of his face, make silly sounds, and even try to touch his uniform. He had mastered the art of remaining completely motionless, no matter what distractions came his way. This group seemed no different from the hundreds of others who had tried similar stunts. The morning continued with the usual parade of visitors. Families posed for photos at a respectful distance. Children pointed excitedly at his tall hat, and tour guides explained the history and significance of the Queen's Guard to their groups. James found a strange comfort in the routine, even as his feet began to ache from standing perfectly still for hours. But the group of young tourists hadn't moved on like the others. They lingered nearby, growing bolder with each passing minute. The blonde leader kept making increasingly ridiculous faces, while his friends recorded everything, their laughter becoming more disruptive to other visitors trying to enjoy the historic sight. An elderly British couple walking past shook their heads disapprovingly at the group's behavior. "No respect whatsoever," the woman muttered to her husband. In our day, people understood the importance of tradition. Her husband nodded in agreement, but they continued walking, unwilling to confront the boisterous tourists. The group noticed the disapproving looks. It seemed to feed off the negative attention. They were clearly enjoying being the center of attention, treating the entire experience like their personal entertainment show. The blonde leader pulled out an expensive coffee cup from a nearby cafe. Still steaming hot with what appeared to be a large latte, "If making faces won't work," he announced to his friends with a wicked grin. "Maybe this will get a reaction." He held up the coffee cup, and his friends immediately understood what he was planning. Their phones were ready, fingers poised over the record buttons, excited to capture what they believed would be the ultimate viral moment. James remained in position, unaware of the escalating situation developing just feet away from him. His training had taught him to expect the unexpected, but in all his years of service, he had never imagined that tourists would cross the line from mere annoyance to actual assault. The sacred trust between the guards and the public was about to be broken in the most shocking way possible. The other tourists in the area began to sense that something was different about this group. Parents pulled their children a little closer, and several visitors slowed their pace to see what was happening. The atmosphere in the courtyard shifted from one of respectful tourism to uncomfortable tension. Though most people still had no idea how far the situation was about to escalate, James stood perfectly still, his breathing steady and controlled, his mind focused on his duty to protect the royal residence. He had no way of knowing that in just moments his life would change forever, and that the actions of these thoughtless tourists would set in motion a series of events that would shock not just everyone present, but people around the world. Without warning, the blonde tourist hurled the scalding coffee directly at James. The hot liquid splashed across his face and uniform, the burning sensation immediate and intense. Steam rose from his red tunic as the coffee soaked through the fabric. But James did something that stunned everyone watching. He didn't move a single muscle. The group of tourists erupted in laughter, their phones capturing every second of what they thought was hilarious entertainment. "Did you see that?" He didn't even flinch. The blonde shouted triumphantly to his friends. They high-fived each other, completely unaware of the severity of what they had just done. But the other tourists in the courtyard were not laughing. A shocked silence fell over the crowd as people processed what they had just witnessed. An American family with 2 young children stared in disbelief, the father instinctively stepping in front of his kids to shield them from the disturbing scene. A group of Japanese tourists lowered their cameras, their faces showing a mixture of confusion and horror. James felt the coffee burning his skin, particularly around his neck where it had seeped under his collar. The liquid was still steaming hot, and every instinct in his body screamed at him to react, to wipe his face, to step away from his post. But his training ran deeper than physical discomfort. He remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight ahead, even as the coffee continued to drip from his chin onto his uniform. "Oh my God, that's not normal," whispered a teenage girl who had been watching from nearby. Her mother pulled her away quickly, disturbed by what they had witnessed. More people began to gather, but not to laugh or take photos. They were genuinely concerned about the guards' well-being. The group of tourists, however, was still celebrating their supposed victory. They replayed the video on their phones, zooming in on James's face at the moment of impact. "This is going to get millions of views," one of them declared excitedly. They were so caught up in their own entertainment that they failed to notice the changing mood of everyone around them. An elderly British veteran who had been touring the castle with his grandson approached the group with fury in his eyes. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice shaking with anger. "That man is a serving soldier, not your personal entertainment." The tourists looked at him with confusion, as if they couldn't understand why anyone would be upset. "Relax. Old man, it's just a joke," the blonde replied dismissively. "He's fine, see? He's not even moving." This response only made the veteran angrier, and several other onlookers began to voice their disapproval as well. James could hear the commotion around him, but his focus remained unbroken. The coffee had cooled somewhat, but his face still stung from the heat. He could smell the strong aroma of the coffee that had splashed across his uniform and felt drops still falling from his hat onto the ground below. Yet, he stood as motionless as a statue, his breathing steady and controlled. A security guard, who had been patrolling the area, noticed the gathering crowd and began walking toward the disturbance. As he got closer, he could see the coffee stains on James's uniform and immediately understood what had happened. His hand moved instinctively toward his radio to call for backup and medical assistance. The group of tourists finally began to realize that their prank wasn't being received as the harmless fun they had intended. People were staring at them with disgust and anger, and several visitors had pulled out their own phones, not to laugh at the guard, but to document the tourists' inappropriate behavior. "Maybe we should go," one of the quieter members of the group suggested nervously. He had noticed a police officer in the distance and was starting to understand that they might have crossed a legal line. It's not just a moral one, but the blonde leader was still riding high on his perceived success. "No way. This is perfect content," he insisted, still filming James's motionless figure. "Look at him, he's like a robot. I bet we could do it again and he still wouldn't move." The crowd around them grew larger and more hostile. Parents were explaining to their children that what they had witnessed was wrong, while other tourists expressed their shock and disgust in multiple languages. The atmosphere in the royal courtyard had completely changed from one of respectful sightseeing to one of tension and outrage. James remained at his post, the coffee now completely soaked into his uniform, creating dark stains across the bright red fabric. His face showed no emotion, no pain, no acknowledgement of what had happened to him. To the untrained eye, he appeared completely unaffected by the assault. But beneath his stoic exterior, something was building that would soon surprise everyone present. The security guard finally reached the group, his expression serious and his hands still near his radio. "What happened here?" he demanded, looking at the coffee-stained guard, and then at the group of tourists who were still holding their phones and looking, increasingly uncomfortable with the attention they were receiving. The security guard didn't wait for an answer from the tourists. The evidence was clear. Coffee stains covered James's uniform, and the empty cup lay on the ground nearby. Several witnesses immediately stepped forward to explain what they had seen, their voices overlapping in their eagerness to report the outrageous behavior. "They threw hot coffee at the guard," explained the elderly veteran, pointing directly at the blonde tourist. "Filmed the whole thing like it was some kind of joke. Disgraceful behavior." His grandson nodded vigorously, still clutching his grandfather's hand tightly after witnessing something that had clearly upset him. The security guard spoke quickly into his radio, calling for police assistance and medical support. Within minutes, the sound of approaching sirens could be heard in the distance. The group of tourists, who had been so confident just moments before, began to look genuinely worried for the first time. "We didn't do anything illegal," the blonde protested weakly, but his voice lacked the arrogance it had carried earlier. "It's not like we hurt him or anything. He's fine. Look at him." He gestured toward James, who continued to stand perfectly still, despite everything that had happened. A middle-aged woman from Canada who had witnessed the entire incident shook her head in disbelief. "Fine. You threw scalding coffee at a person. How is that fine?" she demanded. Other tourists voiced their agreement, creating a chorus of condemnation that made the group increasingly uncomfortable. The police arrived quickly, their presence immediately changing the dynamic of the situation. 2 officers approached the scene while a third began speaking with witnesses who had gathered around the area. The lead officer, Sergeant Patricia Reynolds, had over 15 years of experience dealing with tourist incidents around London's royal sites, but she had never seen anything quite like this. "Right then," Sergeant Reynolds said authoritatively, "I need to understand exactly what happened here." She looked at James, taking note of his coffee-stained uniform and the liquid still visible on his face and hat. Despite the obvious assault he had endured, he remained completely motionless in his position. The witnesses eagerly provided their accounts of what had transpired. Multiple people had captured parts of the incident on their phones, including the moment when the coffee was thrown and the tourist celebration afterward. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. "This is assault," Sergeant Reynolds declared firmly, looking directly at the group of tourists. "Throwing a hot beverage at someone is not a prank. It's a criminal offense." She began reading them their rights while her colleagues started the process of taking them into custody. The blonde tourist demeanor changed completely as the reality of his situation sank in. "Wait, this is crazy," he protested as handcuffs were placed on his wrists. "We're tourists. We didn't know. It was just supposed to be funny." His friends echoed similar protests, but their excuses fell on deaf ears. As the tourists were being arrested, something unexpected began to happen. James, who had remained perfectly still throughout the entire ordeal, slowly began to move. It wasn't the sudden break in composure that everyone might have expected. It was something far more deliberate and surprising, with precise, controlled movements. James reached into his uniform and pulled out a pristine white handkerchief. The crowd watched in fascination as he calmly began to clean the coffee from his face, his movements measured and dignified. There was no anger in his expression, no frustration or pain, just the quiet professionalism of someone who had endured far worse challenges than inconsiderate tourists. The onlookers were mesmerized by his composure. Here was a man who had been assaulted with hot coffee, humiliated in front of hundreds of people, and yet he maintained his dignity throughout the entire experience. Parents pointed him out to their children as an example of true strength and character. "That," said the elderly veteran quietly to his grandson, "is what real courage looks like. Not the loud, attention-seeking behavior of those fools, but quiet strength in the face of adversity." The boy nodded solemnly, understanding that he was witnessing something important, even if he couldn't fully grasp all the implications. James finished cleaning his face and carefully folded his handkerchief before returning it to his uniform. He then did something that surprised everyone even more. He looked directly at the crowd that had gathered and gave a small, respectful nod of acknowledgement to those who had defended him. The gesture was simple, but it had a profound impact on everyone who witnessed it. Here was a man who had just been attacked and humiliated, yet his first thought was to thank those who had stood up for him. The crowd responded with spontaneous applause, sound that echoed off the ancient stone walls of the castle. But James wasn't finished. As the police completed the arrest of the tourists and began leading them away, took one more action that would leave everyone present with a story they would never forget. Something that would transform this incident from a simple case of tourist misbehavior into a moment that would be talked about for years to come. As the arrested tourists were being escorted away, James stepped forward from his post for the first time. The crowd watched in stunned silence, unsure of what he was planning to do. His movement was deliberate and purposeful, each step measured with military precision. He walked directly toward the blonde tourist who had thrown the coffee, who was now in handcuffs and looking thoroughly defeated. The young man's arrogance had completely evaporated, replaced by genuine fear about what consequences he might face. His friends were equally subdued, finally understanding the gravity of their actions. When James reached the group, he stopped directly in front of the blonde tourist. For a moment, the two men stood face to face, one representing centuries of British military tradition and honor, the other embodying the worst aspects of entitled, social media-obsessed tourism. "What's your name?" James asked quietly, his voice calm, but carrying an authority that made everyone lean in to listen. The tourist hesitated, glancing nervously at the police officers before answering. Marcus Thompson," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Gone was the loud, confident persona he had displayed just minutes earlier. James nodded slowly. "Marcus Thompson," he repeated as if committing the name to memory. "I want you to understand something very important. I've served my country for 6 years. I've stood guard in all weather conditions, been stationed in dangerous locations overseas, and dedicated my life to protecting the people and traditions of this nation." The crowd was completely silent, hanging on every word. Even the police officers had paused their activities to listen to what the guard had to say. Marcus looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground, the weight of James's words clearly affecting him. "When you threw that coffee at me," James continued, "you weren't just attacking a person doing his job. You were attacking everything I represent: duty, honor, respect, in service to something greater than oneself." His voice remained steady, but there was an undeniable power in his words that made everyone present feel the significance of the moment. Marcus's eyes filled with tears as the full impact of his actions finally hit him. I'm sorry," he stammered. I didn't realize." James raised his hand slightly, a gesture that immediately silenced the young man. "Sorry isn't enough," he said firmly, "but I'm going to give you an opportunity that you don't deserve. Because that's what people like me do. We serve others, even when they don't serve us." The crowd leaned in even closer, curious about what kind of opportunity James could possibly offer to someone who had just assaulted him. The police officers exchanged glances, equally intrigued by this unexpected development. "I'm going to make you an offer," James announced, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Instead of pressing full charges against you for assault, I'm willing to accept community service, but not just any community service. You're going to spend 1 week volunteering at a veterans hospital, listening to the stories of people who have actually sacrificed for their country." Marcus looked up in surprise, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. His friends also seemed shocked that the guard they had tormented was potentially offering them a way to avoid serious criminal charges. "Furthermore," James continued, "you're going to create a public video apology, not for your social media followers, but for the British people and military families everywhere who were insulted by your behavior today, and you're going to donate the money you would have spent on the rest of your vacation to a military charity." Sergeant Reynolds stepped forward, clearly impressed by James's proposal. "That's remarkably generous," she said to the guard before turning to Marcus. "This man is offering you a chance to learn from your mistake instead of simply being punished for it. I'd strongly suggest you take it." Marcus nodded vigorously, tears now flowing freely down his face. Yes, absolutely. Thank you. I'm so sorry, I really am." His friends echoed similar sentiments. all of them clearly moved by James's unexpected show of mercy and wisdom. But James wasn't finished with his conditions. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice taking on a slightly different tone. "You're going to spend one full day standing guard with me. You'll wear a uniform, stand perfectly still for hours, and experience just a small fraction of what it means to serve others instead of yourself." The crowd murmured in appreciation of this creative consequence. Many people smiled at the thought of the self-centered tourist. Being forced to experience the discipline and dedication required of a royal guard, it seemed like perfect justice, education, instead of mere punishment. Marcus agreed immediately to all the conditions. His entire attitude transformed from arrogant entitlement to humble gratitude. The police officers worked out the legal details with James and Sergeant Reynolds, creating an alternative punishment program that would satisfy the requirements of justice while potentially creating real change in the offender. As the arrangements were being finalized, something extraordinary happened that none of them could have predicted. The story was about to take another turn that would capture the attention of people around the world and transform both James and Marcus in ways neither of them could have imagined. As news of the incident began to spread, something unexpected started happening. The tourists who had witnessed James's remarkable response began sharing their own videos and photos on social media, not to mock or entertain, but to praise the guard's extraordinary display of character and leadership. Within hours, #RoyalGuardWisdom was trending worldwide. The video showed not just Marcus throwing the coffee, but James's dignified response, his offer of redemption instead of revenge, and his powerful speech about duty and honor. People from around the globe were inspired by his example of turning a moment of cruelty into an opportunity for education and growth. Major news outlets picked up the story quickly. The BBC, CNN, and international news services all featured segments about the incident, focusing not on the attack itself, but on James's remarkable response. Military families, veterans, and people from all walks of life were sharing the videos and expressing their admiration for the guard's conduct. Marcus, meanwhile, was experiencing a complete transformation. The young man who had arrived in London as an arrogant social media influencer with over 1 million followers was now facing the consequences of his actions in ways he never could have imagined. His original video of the coffee-throwing incident had been deleted, but not before it had been saved and shared by others. As evidence of his poor behavior, the backlash from his own followers was swift and brutal. Comments poured in from around the world, with people expressing their disgust at his behavior and their admiration for James's response. Many of his sponsors dropped him immediately. His social media accounts began losing thousands of followers every hour. But something remarkable was happening to Marcus during this public shaming. Instead of becoming defensive or angry, he found himself genuinely reflecting on his actions and their impact. The weight of James's words about service and sacrifice had hit him harder than any punishment could have. True to his word, Marcus began his community service at the Royal Hospital, Chelsea, working with elderly military veterans who had served their country in various conflicts over the decades. On his first day, he met William Harrison, a 94-year-old World War II veteran who had lost his leg during the DAI landings. "So you're the young man who attacked one of our guards?" William said matter-of-factly when Marcus introduced himself. The old soldier's direct approach made Marcus uncomfortable, but also forced him to confront what he had done without the buffer of excuses or rationalizations. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied quietly. "I'm here to try to make up for what I did, though I know it's not enough." William studied the young man for a long moment before nodding approvingly. "At least you're honest about it," William said. "That's more than most people would be. Now, if you really want to understand what you disrespected, let me tell you about the men I served with who never made it home." Over the following days, Marcus listened to dozens of stories from veterans who had sacrificed everything for their country and their fellow soldiers. He heard about young men who had died far from home, families who had endured years of separation and worry, and the quiet heroism of people who had served without expecting recognition or reward. Meanwhile, James had returned to his regular duties, but his life had changed dramatically. Letters and emails poured in from around the world, thanking him for his example and sharing stories of how his response had inspired people to handle their own conflicts with greater wisdom and compassion. The royal family took notice of the incident as well. James received a personal letter from senior palace officials, commending his conduct and noting that his actions had reflected the highest values of the monarchy and the military. Rumors began circulating that he might receive special recognition for his handling of the situation, but perhaps the most significant change was happening in the relationship between James and Marcus. As Marcus completed his community service and prepared for his day of standing guard, the two men began to correspond. What started as formal exchanges about the logistics of Marcus's punishment evolved into deeper conversations about service, purpose, and personal growth. Marcus wrote to James about his experiences at the Veterans Hospital, describing how the stories he had heard had completely changed his perspective on what it meant to live a meaningful life. He talked about his shame at having wasted years focused on superficial social media popularity while ignoring opportunities to contribute something valuable to the world. James, in turn, shared his own journey toward understanding the meaning of service. He wrote about the challenges of military life, the sacrifices required, the deep satisfaction that came from being part of something larger than oneself. Their correspondence revealed two very different men finding common ground in their shared humanity. As the day approached for Marcus to fulfill his promise to stand guard alongside James, both men were nervous about how the public would react. The media attention hadn't died down, if anything. It had intensified as people followed the story of the tourist's remarkable transformation and the guards' continuing grace under pressure. The stage was set for a final chapter that would complete one of the most unusual redemption stories in recent memory, bringing together a decorated military professional and a reformed social media influencer in a display of human growth that would inspire millions of people worldwide. The morning of Marcus's guard duty arrived with unprecedented media attention. News crews from around the world had gathered outside Windsor Castle, creating a circus-like atmosphere that stood in stark contrast to the solemn purpose of the day's events. Security had been increased significantly to manage the crowds and ensure that the dignity of the occasion was maintained. Marcus arrived early, his transformation evident to everyone who saw him. Gone was the arrogant young man who had thrown coffee at a guard just 2 weeks earlier. In his place stood someone who carried himself with newfound humility and purpose. His expensive designer clothes had been replaced with a simple, dignified attire appropriate for someone about to undertake a serious responsibility. James met Marcus at the guard quarters, where he would be fitted with a traditional uniform and briefed on his duties. The two men had corresponded extensively, but this was only their second face-to-face meeting since the incident. The atmosphere was respectful, but tinged with the weight of the journey they had both traveled. "Are you ready for this?" James asked quietly as Marcus was helped into the red tunic and tall bearskin hat that had become symbols of British military tradition around the world. Marcus nodded solemnly. "I've been preparing for 2 weeks," he replied. "The veterans at the hospital taught me what this uniform really represents. I won't dishonor it again." His voice carried a sincerity that would have been impossible to imagine from the person it had been before. As they walked toward their posts, Marcus struggled with the weight and awkwardness of the traditional uniform. The bearskin hat was heavier than he had expected, and the formal military posture required muscles he had never properly developed. James walked beside him, offering quiet guidance and encouragement. The crowd that had gathered was enormous, but notably different from typical tourist gatherings. Many people had come specifically to witness this unique moment of redemption and reconciliation. Veterans groups were present, along with military families who had been moved by the story. The atmosphere was respectful and almost reverent. As they took their positions side by side, Marcus felt the full weight of what he was about to undertake. Standing perfectly still for hours, while maintaining complete composure, was far more challenging than he had imagined. Within the first 30 minutes, his feet began to ache, his back started to cramp, and sweat began forming under the heavy hat. But every time Marcus felt the urge to move or adjust his position, he remembered the stories he had heard from the veterans. He thought about William Harrison, who had stood watch in far more dangerous conditions while under enemy fire. He remembered the widow who had told him about her husband's years of faithful service, and the children who had grown up without their father because he had died protecting others. The crowd watching was surprisingly respectful. Unlike typical tourist behavior around the guards, people maintained a reverent distance and spoke in hushed tones. Many were clearly moved by witnessing Marcus's attempt to understand and honor what he had previously mocked. As the hours passed, Marcus began to understand something profound about the nature of service. The physical discomfort was real, but it paled in comparison to the mental discipline required to maintain focus while standing guard over something greater than oneself. He began to glimpse what James and thousands of other guards experienced every day: the quiet satisfaction of fulfilling a duty that most people would never understand or appreciate. Midway through the duty period, an unexpected visitor arrived. William Harrison, the 94-year-old veteran Marcus had met during his community service, made the journey to Windsor Castle despite his advanced age and mobility challenges. He approached the two guards slowly, using his walking cane for support. The old soldier stood silently before Marcus and James for several minutes, his eyes taking in the sight of the former social media influencer now standing at attention in full military dress. Finally, he spoke in a voice that carried across the courtyard despite its quiet tone. "That's what real strength looks like," William said, addressing the crowd more than the guards themselves. "Not the loud, attention-seeking behavior we see too much of today, but quiet dedication to something bigger than yourself." He paused, looking directly at Marcus. This young man has learned what many people never understand, that true honor comes from serving others, not serving yourself. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, a sound that seemed to validate everything that had happened over the past 2 weeks. Marcus felt tears forming in his eyes but fought to maintain his composure, knowing that breaking his military bearing would dishonor the moment and everything he had learned. As the day concluded and Marcus completed his full shift of guard duty, James placed a hand on his shoulder in a gesture of respect and brotherhood. Both men had been changed by their experience. James had learned about the power of mercy and second chances, while Marcus had discovered the meaning of genuine service and sacrifice. The story of their transformation spread around the world, inspiring countless others to reconsider their own priorities and behaviors. Marcus used his remaining social media platform to share the lessons he had learned, focusing his content on highlighting the stories of veterans and service members rather than promoting himself. James returned to his regular duties, but his example had already influenced military traditions around the globe. Training programs began incorporating his response as a model for how to handle difficult situations with wisdom and grace rather than mere discipline. Years later, both men would look back on that day when coffee was thrown and dignity was maintained as the moment that changed their lives forever. It had transformed a simple tourist incident into a powerful lesson about redemption, respect, and the true meaning of service that would inspire generations to come.